Good afternoon, folks, and welcome. I'm Dennis Stover, the Regional Vice Chancellor for Advancement, and we are so proud that you're here celebrating our second event in our 40th anniversary year. We're going to do about 15 events this year, and we'd like to invite you to every one of them. And guess what? You have a listing of those if you picked up one of our 40th brochures. On the back, we have our listing of our events that are happening this year. So please join us. I'd also like to acknowledge before we start our sponsors for our 40th anniversary. If you look at the poster over here, you can see we have numerous folks that are supporting each of the events this year. We're very proud of that. And one of those supporters helps us not only our 40th year, but every year. Charles claps out on his team of METV. Thank you, Charles, for what you do for our university. Our Knowledge-A-Bull series started 2 years ago, where we bring distinguished fellows from around the country and our local community to share insights about what they're doing. And tonight we have an author. So I'd like to invite to our stage our Chancellor for USF SM, Dr. Sandra Stone, to tell you a little bit about Tom.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming and joining us tonight for the first of our Knowledge-A-Bull speaker series for this year. The speaker series allows us to engage students, faculty, staff, alumni, and the community in cutting-edge conversations with experts on subjects that have meaning in our lives. I'm honored to introduce tonight's speaker because he's not only an award-winning journalist, writer, and editor for nearly 40 years, but he's also a friend and a somewhat relative. He and my husband, Tony, are cousins. So I've known Tom for probably 25 years now, so a long, long time. And I'd also like to introduce you to his wife, Lisa, who's with us tonight as well, and his sister-in-law, Susan, who's also here. So we're having a little family reunion. It's kind of fun. So let me just tell you a little bit about Tom before he starts to speak. He's been an award-winning journalist, writer, and editor for nearly 40 years. He's the author of Acid Test, LSD, Ecstasy, and the Power to Heal, which is out on the table, and you can purchase one and he will sign it for you after, about the resurgence of research into the medical use of psychedelic drugs. He is co-author of Fire on the Horizon, the untold story of the Gulf oil disaster, which is close to home here. I think the neighborhoods here or the area here just got some money from that settlement recently. And sole author of Old Souls, Compelling Evidence from Children Who Remember Past Lives, which is a classic study of the border between science and mysticism. As editor of the Washington Post magazine between 2001 and 2009, he oversaw staff writer Gene Weingarten's 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning feature stories, Fiddler in the Subway and Fatal Distraction. As an independent editor, he has edited such New York Times bestsellers as Overwhelmed, Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time by Bridget Schulte, and Top Secret America by Dana Priest and William Arkin. Tom's Hunt for bin Laden, based on 15 years of reporting by the Washington Post, became the #1 seller on Kindle on Amazon.com, and he's also known for co-creating the Tropic Hunt, a mass participation puzzle attended by thousands, which has become the Washington Post Hunt in Washington, D.C. In addition to being an author and editor of narrative journalism, Tom is one of the foremost editors of humor in the country. He's edited humor columns by Dave Barry, Gene Weingarten, and Tony Kornheiser, as well as conceived and launched the internationally syndicated comic strip Cul-de-sac by Richard Thompson. With humorist Barry and novelist Carl Hassan and Elmore Leonard, he concocted and edited Naked Came the Manatee, a satirical serial novel that became a New York Times bestseller. Tom was born in New York City in 1954, son of a novelist and builder, and the grandson of McKinley Cantor, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his Civil War novel, Andersonville. He attended the University of Florida, but we'll forgive him for that. Just for tonight. Where he became editor of the 22,000 circulation student daily newspaper, despite the fact that he was an anthropology major, an affront for which the university's journalism faculty was slow to forgive him. After graduation in 1976, he wrote national award-winning features for the Fort Myers News Press, the Tallahassee Democrat, the Cincinnati Enquirer, and the Miami Herald. At the Herald, he became editor of Tropic magazine, which earned 2 Pulitzer Prizes during his tenure. It is my absolute delight and your treat, Tom Shroder.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. This is very special to me to be here talking about this book because, first, not only because I grew up in Sarasota and I consider it my hometown and it was so formative, but also the events of the book really, and my interest in the book really began in Sarasota and right next door here at New College. And in fact, this area right here, I was delighted to learn that it was the former site of the Trail Drive-In movie theater. And I had this like strong impulse as we were driving up to stop the car outside the gate, get in the trunk, and not that I ever really did that. So I'll tell you a little bit about, I think this is a controversial subject, and I'll just tell you how I have a very long history with this book. So go ahead and show this handsome young man here. That's me in 1975, and those crystal white, sugar-like sand substance behind me is Siesta Key Beach. And like I said, growing up here was really important to me. I went to the University of Florida, but I'd come back for vacations and holidays. And next slide. And so I came home on break one time, and I became aware that there was this really amazing house going up just east of town. Back then it was kind of in the woods. Now it's like, now it's like closer to the coast than it is to the edge of town. But back then it was the edge of town. And there was this guy, this young guy that you see in this image, who was building it, and he had a pet wolf. And he was just a fascinating guy. And there was something, he had inherited some money from his grandfather. And he was a student at New College, and he had decided that what he wanted to do with this money was build this beautiful house. And he got artisans from all over and everything. And so I found this really interesting, and I was the editor of the University of Florida student paper, as you heard. So I decided this would be a good feature story for our supplement magazine, which you see there. We called it Extra. And show the next picture. And that's the article that I wrote. And I came down and I interviewed him. You can see this house is really impressive. And I thought that the idea of this college student, building this kind of dream house, really supervising it himself and doing a lot of physical support would appeal to students. So, I interviewed him, and he had an interesting philosophy that kind of stuck with me. And that was that. And I went on and I finished college. I began a newspaper career. And then by 1985, 10 years later, I was the editor of Tropic magazine at the Miami Herald. And I saw a story in the Tampa paper about a New College student, a perennial New College student by that point, who there was this odd window in time where a synthetic psychedelic drug called MDMA, which was known by the street name of ecstasy, and it had become a big party drug. There was this student from New College who was proclaiming it as sort of the key to a revolution in psychiatry. Next slide, please. Well, this was the New College campus, and this sort of palm court, which is right next door, was a scene of a lot of his experimentation when he was there. But next slide. Oops. Okay, one more. Okay, that is the story. I assigned a reporter to do a story about this guy who's like saying, look, you can use this psychedelic drug that everybody knew as a party drug, that actually you could use it in therapy and it had dramatic results. And I thought that was an interesting position to have, but I was skeptical about it. And then another 20 years go by, really, And by that point, I was the editor of the Washington Post magazine. And I saw a story in the New York Times that the Harvard University was doing its first study of psychedelic drugs in a clinical use since they had kicked Tim Leary out in the 60s. And do that again. And there was one more slide. And there was this man behind the study. His name was Rick Doblin. It was the same guy that had been the hippie in the house, the same guy who had been the new college student in 1985 that I saw in the Tampa newspaper. And here he was behind he had a nonprofit foundation that was supporting this research, and that he had managed to persuade an institution as prominent and conservative as Harvard that it was worth studying as a drug that could be used clinically. And in this case, he was using it to help people who had terminal cancer, and they were suffering from terrible end-of-life anxiety. And the idea was that, I guess one of the reasons they chose that was because, the idea that if they had terminal cancer, then the fear that these psychedelic drugs would be doing some harm wouldn't be so great. So I decided, okay, I'm going to write a story about this myself this time. This is too great a coincidence. So I called him up, and not only did he remember me, he had just talked to his board of directors, and he had showed them both the story that I had written when I was in college and the story that I had commissioned in 1985 as a way to tell his board of directors how far he had come in his image from this wild hippie to somebody who was behind the first Harvard study in 30 years. So what I discovered, and I decided this story, and what I discovered about this was that it really wasn't as wild as it seemed. That the idea to use this drug that had been considered to be incredibly dangerous in the 60s, it had been put on Schedule I, which was along with heroin among the most highly controlled class of drugs. That it wasn't so remarkable, really, that somebody would think, no, this could be used clinically, because from the period since LSD was discovered in the late 1940s and sent out by Sandoz Laboratory to universities and researchers around the world, there was a 15-year period there when not only was it experimented with in clinical settings, but it was considered to be successful. It was used for all sorts of things. It was used for everything from marriage counseling to addiction cessation. People used it for, to help people stop being alcoholics, people to break opiate addiction. And they had remarkable success with it. In 1960, someone did a study of all the studies that people had done, and they determined that in like tens of thousands of doses of psychedelic drugs had been given out under controlled clinical conditions, and they said it had remarkable results, sometimes almost seemingly like miraculous results, where people who had long-term psychiatric problems, like addiction or trauma-induced psychosis, that they had results within a period of weeks that hadn't been attained in years of therapy, of traditional therapy. And not only that, but that there were very few, if any, physiological bad results as a result of this clinical use. And even there were some adverse psychiatric results, but they were very few and far between. And mostly they were related to a previous psychiatric illness of some kind. So they were saying that under medical supervision in clinical situations, that it was safe to use and highly effective. So this was the state of, go back a couple of slides. This man, Stanislav Grof, was a psychiatrist in Czechoslovakia. And he saw the early sort of clinical, what happened was they sent LSD out to all these labs, and at first they thought, well, this kind of mimics this state that you get when you take LSD, kind of mimics psychosis. So maybe that would allow us to understand, we don't understand psychosis at all. So maybe what will happen is we can observe people and in a controlled way, and we can learn something about psychosis. And then the people who were administering these tests would try it themselves. And the experience they had would be so impressive to them that they decided, well, wait a second, this doesn't just mimic psychosis. This creates a kind of mystical type experience that's very similar to the kind of religious conversion experiences that people have written about for generations. And not only that, but it gives me insight that permanently changes my life and affects my behavior and gets me out of negative patterns and puts me onto a much healthier kind of thing where I'm making decisions that are for my long-term good rather than for short-term pleasure or gain. And that's what they discovered, was that when people had these kind of experiences, that it was the experience in itself that was allowing them to cure of whatever the psychiatric illness. Like there were people who had been alcoholics for decades, and they'd have this kind of mystical type experience where they would feel elevated. They would see that, suddenly they would see that what they were doing to their body was damaging it, and that the gains that they thought they were getting from it suddenly didn't seem that important to them. And instead, what seemed important to them was their long-term health and growth. So that was the state of what was going on in up until through the mid-60s. And of course, at the same time, the CIA had decided that this was a potential weapon because it was so powerful, it had such powerful psychiatric effects. And they were giving it to people thinking that maybe it would be in sort of like their version of enhanced interrogation, that they'd give people LSD and then they'd interrogate them harshly and hope that they could then sort of break them down that way. They also thought at one point that maybe they could use it to render their own agents incapable of revealing any important information because they'd take it if they were going to be interrogated by the enemy, and they'd be so addled that they wouldn't be able to say anything useful. And they also sort of looked at the idea of possibly infecting an entire city's water supply with it as an act of war. None of this was worth anything. It really wasn't effective for any of this stuff. But what they did was they pumped lots of LSD into the system. And they were the CIA was secretly funding an enormous amount of LSD research. And so these drugs, in poorly audited type of, like they were doing something in Menlo Park at the mental hospital there, and somebody named Kem Kesey was volunteered to take this LSD. And he ended up writing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, forming this thing called the Merry Pranksters, and popularizing LSD. And so there were a lot of people who had this experience thanks to the CIA experiments. And they had a big experience too. And so they thought, wow, this is really something that I want to do and I want to share with the world. And a guy named Owsley, who was the son of a senator, decided to go to the Berkeley Library and teach himself how to make this stuff. And he made thousands and thousands of doses. And it began to spread to college campuses across the country. And this is at exactly the moment in history when there was this rebellion against people who were being drafted to Vietnam and saying the war is no good and the whole system is no good. And so the powers that be sort of identified the this psychedelic thing that was happening across the country with this resistance to the status quo. And there was this huge reaction to it, and that's when they made it illegal. They made it as, everybody, there was all these claims that it altered your DNA so that you'd have, you'd have freakish children if you took LSD, which didn't turn out to be true. And of course, uncontrolled use of this drug by people who hadn't been screened for any previous psychiatric problems or any physical problems like heart problems or something was very dangerous. I mean, you have millions of people taking this stuff, and they're taking it under not controlled conditions. Maybe they take it and go on a motorcycle ride, or they'd take it and they would have had previous manic depressive episodes. This was a recipe for disaster. And so every time something like that happened, it made headlines. And so so what they wanted to do was they wanted to stamp out this illegal use. Of course, that didn't work. More and more people kept doing it. It was readily available. But what they effectively did was they totally shut down all legitimate research on the drugs. And so Rick Doblin was this guy at New College, and he came to it in an illegal way. He had these experiences that he found troubling, and yet he felt that there was something valuable there. Then he discovered through reading this man, Stan Grof, about all this research in the 60s, and he decided, hey, this is too important to just give up on. So what my book is about his 30-year quest to bring back legitimate research to psychedelic medicine. Next slide, please. And this man is a psychiatrist he was an emergency room doctor, and he kept finding people at the end of knife wounds and bullet wounds and drug addiction. And his name is Michael Mithoefer, and that's his wife Annie, and she's a psychiatric nurse. And he decided that he wanted to that he was getting the end result of all this mental dysfunction. That the reason why people got in knife fights or got shot or the addiction was because they had these untreated psychological traumas. And he decided he wanted to get on the other end of that, and he wanted to treat them. So he became a psychiatrist, and he specialized in post-traumatic stress disorder. And there weren't any really effective treatments for that. And he had experiences in college, just like Rick Doblin did, with LSD that were troubling to him, but at the same time, he had this experience of having these tremendous insights and of them changing his outlook on life in a positive way. So he had that in his mind, and then he found that Stan Grof was saying, okay, we can't use LSD anymore, but the basic thing underlying it is this sort of altered consciousness, that it's the altered consciousness that LSD produced that's doing the healing. So Stan Grof found other ways to do this, and one of them was this rapid breathing technique with loud music and hyperventilation, really, and it sort of produced this temporary state of altered consciousness, and he had some tremendous results, and he called it holotropic breath work. And so Michael went out to study this, and he found it, and he started using it in his practice, and he found it was effective. But he felt that, it didn't work for everybody, and he thought that these problems were so tough. He had a woman whose life had been ruined by cocaine addiction, and she tried the holotropic breath work, and she said, it just doesn't work for me. And he felt it was almost unethical that there were these other methods out there, psychedelic drugs, that possibly could work for her, and that they weren't even allowed to study them. So he went to a conference, and he saw Rick Doblin there, And Rick Doblin, meanwhile, had been doing this research, but he couldn't find any, this was so stigmatized that he couldn't find any psychiatrists who were willing to do the research because it would destroy their careers. So when Michael came up to him and said, I would like to do research with psychedelic drugs, and I'd like to know if you know what country I might be able to do that in. And Rick said, are you a psychiatrist? And he said, yes. And he says, we're going to do them right here, and I'm going to help you. And so then they began a 10-year period of trying to get the first studies approved for using MDMA to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. And they got, I mean, it was an amazingly difficult task to get through the FDA and the DEA, but finally they did that. And next slide, please. And after they had a very successful study where they mostly women who were victims of either rape or sexual abuse, and they were treatment resistant, which means they tried all these other treatments for the PTSD, and it was ruining their lives, and they couldn't get any relief. So after a few sessions with MDMA, what they do is they give them the MDMA, and then they're there. He and Annie are on either side of them, and as the memories and the trauma come up, they're just there to talk to them, and they use a combination of talk therapy and the effects of the drug. And after 3 sessions, 80% of the people in these sessions, they're tested by an objective measure to see, before they go in, how bad their PTSD is. And it's done by an independent tester who has nothing to do with Michael or Annie, so they can evaluate this fairly. And then they're tested immediately after the therapy, 3 months after the therapy, and then they do a long-term follow-up, in some cases as long as 6 years after. And after 3 months after the therapy, with no further therapy except for a debrief afterwards, 80% of them no longer even rated as even having PTSD. And almost all of them held on to those gains from 3 to 6 years afterwards. So after that, he realized that we have this huge problem in that we've got 500,000 people who served in our military in our long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. 500,000 of them are coming back with diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a huge problem because this is a very treatment-resistant illness. It can last for decades. There was a woman at Harvard who estimated that over the next 30 years, in terms of lost productivity, what we owe them in terms of medical care, and also direct through disability payments, that it's going to cost us taxpayers $1 trillion over 30 years to deal with this huge problem created by these wars. So you would think that if there was a way to very cheaply, these drugs are inexpensive because they're not patentable, they're not difficult to produce, and the main cost in the treatment is the time it takes, for these. But you have these sessions. If it's true that a limited number of sessions can actually cure these things, unlike other psychiatric drugs, which you have to take forever, theoretically, this you take and you actually get cured, that would be a huge boon. So he decided that he was going to do another study with combat veterans who suffered from combat-related PTSD. And this is a man named Nick Blackston, who was a Marine in Iraq, who had terrible experiences. For one thing, he was a machine gunner on top of one of those Humvees. And, so these 2 12-year-old kids come at him and they're firing AK-47s. And, his job is to protect his comrades in the Humvee. So he had to blow these little 12-year-old kids away because they're sitting there firing AK-47s at him. And then, of course, his driver who's right below, he's up here and his driver's right here. They got attacked by a rocket-propelled grenade, and a fragment of the rocket came through the Humvee, severed the femoral artery in his driver, and as they're returning fire, he had to watch his driver bleed to death right below him. So he had all these horrible, horrible experiences. And he came home and he was, he had all the classic signals. He had hallucinations of like people jumping up and firing at him at a Arby's. He couldn't sleep. He felt like he couldn't concentrate. He was trying to go to school. He couldn't study. And he got to the point where he felt like, they gave him, at the VA, they gave him tranquilizers, they gave him antidepressants, they gave him all this stuff that only seemed to make matters worse. And he got to the point where he took out his service revolver and put it up here and was, imagining that the only way he could get rid of this mess in his head would be to pull the trigger. And it was at that point that he found out about this trial. And he went and he had 3 sessions, and he had these dramatic sort of insights into the idea. What he imagined was that he went down to a dungeon and that there was this monster in the dungeon, and he was scared to approach this monster. But as he got closer, he saw that the monster was wearing a Marine uniform. And then he understood that that monster was himself, and that he had put himself in there because he felt that he was a monster. And so suddenly he realized that it really wasn't fair because he was only doing what he was needed to do in the situation. He was doing what he was trained to do. He was doing what the situation required. So he opened the door and he embraced himself. And really from that moment on, it wasn't like it's magic. I mean, you've got a lot of work to do. Your life has been messed up to a horrible degree. But another person in the study put it like they felt like they were wandering through this battlefield and there wasn't any way out. But that when they did this therapy, they lifted over the field and they could see that there were paths out. And it wasn't like they were instantly out, but they knew that there was a path out, where before they had lost all hope. Next slide, please. This is at the end of his sessions. This is a self-portrait here. He'd never taken art, and he really hadn't done anything but rudimentary drawings before then. But immediately after his session, he went into an art class and drew this picture of him sort of confronting his own mortality. And I just thought that was so impressive. And the next slide, please. And now this is how many years out? Maybe 4 years out. And he's an artist. He's got a wife and a child, and he has problems like everybody has, but he no longer feels that he doesn't know how to deal with them. So once again, the study has just been completed. It was a small study, as these things go, but these studies are accumulating around the country and around the world, and in all these cases, they're mirroring the results that they got way back in the 1960s, where a tremendous number of people are actually being outright cured by this, and others are being helped even if they're not completely cured, at least they say that they've gotten something out of it. And so the way this research works is that phase 1 is when they test the drug just to make sure there are no acute effects, that it's not going to kill you. Phase 2 is what they've been doing, where they do a small number of people and they test to see whether not only can it be used safely, but is there good evidence that it really is effective? And they're getting near, and after about 250 or so subjects, if they've gotten good results and it seems safe and it seems effective, then they allow you to go into a phase 3 study, which involves hundreds of people, dozens of locations, and it can cost millions of dollars to do it. And nobody is funding this. This is all privately funding. It's being funded by private donors, and they're doing things like Indiegogo campaigns. And like I said, with this problem that's going to cost all of us, millions and millions of dollars every year. At first they couldn't get the Pentagon even to talk to them. But now they're starting to engage, and the VA is actually sending some of their people that are, the most involved in dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder to talk to them and to design studies together. They're not paying for anything yet, but if this next phase starts to be successful, that could happen. The frustrating thing is that this is slow work, and there are a lot of people that are in severe distress and really hurting. It could take, they predict that it's going to take, I think they're saying 2023 is when they hope to have a prescription medicine. And it's never going to be, the intent is never to have it like you go to the CVS and with a prescription, you hand the prescription and they hand you, the psychedelic drug. The idea is that what will be prescribed is the therapy, and you'll go to a clinic where they do this kind of therapy under these controlled conditions, and maybe they'll start testing whether it would be effective to do group therapy, because that would be more efficient, of course, and some people think it actually helps to have a group dynamic. But everything takes longer than they think it's going to take, so I'm afraid that it's going to be more like 10 to 15 years before you really see that. It's not just MDMA that they're using psilocybin, and an interesting thing about the psilocybin, at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, they did a study where they used it for smoking cessation. And then there wasn't even talk therapy. They just gave them the psilocybin, allowed them to have an experience in a safe place. They had people there if they needed to talk, but it wasn't like any kind of therapy especially. And the results they had were astonishing. Again, 80% of these people were smoke-free 6 months later. The best alternative anti-smoking therapy had a success rate of 35%. And this is a drug that they give that's supposed to act physiologically on your body. But again, the interesting difference is like, on a lot of drugs we take, let's say penicillin. We have an infection, we take penicillin without any involvement of our consciousness. The penicillin attacks the infection and cures it. This isn't like that. This is the awareness of the person is involved in the treatment, and it's their awareness that's changing. I mean, there might be some physiological things going on with the brain as well. They've done some brain scan studies that show that the image of a brain after taking psilocybin is the reverse of an image of a depressed brain, which is kind of interesting, is that the areas of the brain that are suppressed in depression and are reversed from someone who's doing psilocybin. Those areas are more active, and the areas that are more active in a depressed person are less active in someone with psilocybin. And this goes back to what Aldous Huxley said about, he was theorizing. He was a great American writer. He wrote Brave New World and was thought to be a leading thinker and intellectual. And he did mescaline in the 50s. And he found this so revelatory. And his theory was that what it did was that normally our brain screens out reality. It's like a filter that reduces the awesome sort of input of actual reality so we could deal with it, so we could do practical things without being overwhelmed. And that what he thought was that the psychedelic drug removed that filter. So we actually saw more of reality than we normally would. And these brain scan studies have kind of reaffirmed that, because they really thought that they were, because the psychedelic experience, you're seeing colors, it's so dramatic, they were thinking they'd see much more brain activity under the influence of psychedelic drugs. But instead, they actually saw reduced brain activity, which really puzzled them until they started thinking about it and looking at what areas were reduced. And if you think about it, most of our brain activity is constructing a reality. It's taking the sensory information we're getting, and it's like saying, okay, this is the world, and this is me, and who am I? The whole idea about an ego, about creating who your personality is. And so a lot of the brain activity is actually about organizing the information you're getting from the world rather than experiencing it. And that's the part of the brain, the sort of top-down organizing part that quiets down, which it makes sense that all this other stuff, then without all this sort of filtering activity, begins to, and plus there's a whole bunch of connectivity in the brain that there's different parts of the brain communicating with each other that don't normally do it, which could account for some of the insights, et cetera. This is all very incomplete stuff with the brain scans, but that's where the science is going. And Johns Hopkins also did a study with healthy people where they gave them psilocybin, and something like 70% of the people said that it was one of the 5 most significant experiences of their lives. So again, that speaks to the idea that this is creating an experience that allows people to reorder their behaviors and their values in a more positive way. And that's what the Johns Hopkins study showed, was that not only did they say it was a significant experience, but those around them said that their behaviors had changed in a positive way. So that's sort of a description in a nutshell of what's going on. And I think, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to talk about it. Yes?
We have a microphone coming.
Oh, I'm sorry. Wait for the microphone. So,
is it likely that people who are aware of this research and who suffer from PTSD, for instance, would be very encouraged or inclined to experiment without the controls of a clinical study? In short, if I were a soldier with PTSD and I learned about this through your book or other sources,
well,
what would stop me from
in fact,
indulging in LSD or other?
In fact, there are organized efforts among veterans who know that there are certain places in which it's legal to take, in certain religious settings, there are certain religious groups that have a kind of legal right to do this. The Native American Church, for instance.
Is that widespread or pretty limited?
It's limited, but there's this organization of former service people who they go down to Peru and do ayahuasca ceremonies in the jungle with shamans, hoping for this kind of healing. Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. Whenever anybody hears about a kind of drug that might be able to help them, there's always a chance that they're going to be doing this illegally. And once again, it's the process. It can be very damaging and not helpful for that to happen without the supervision. It can be dangerous, and also it's not going to be as effective as it could be. But that doesn't mean that people aren't going to do it, and some people do it and actually have a positive experience. Just like all the researchers involved in it did it illegally to begin with and had enough of a positive experience, so they thought, hey, I want to dedicate my life to seeing if something we can do here. But that's a question a lot of people have. Any others? Yes, over here.
There we go. You touched on it a little bit when you talked about the ayahuasca ceremonies. This is something that native cultures have been familiar with for a long time. It sounds like there's a relationship between these new studies and what has been known for
Yes,
thousands of years, using ayahuasca or peyote and sweat lodges and things like that. I wonder if you could kind of elaborate more on that.
Yeah, well, they're quite aware that, in fact, our Western culture in the last couple hundred years is one of the few cultures that did not have some kind of use of these kind of substances in relationship to religious practice. And that's really been more of the rule throughout the world and throughout history and throughout prehistory even than the contrary. And there's a researcher at Harvard who went out to a community of Navajo who'd been doing these peyote ceremonies for years. And his idea was, well, okay, the good thing was that as part of being part of this peyote cult in the Native American church, they also forswore alcohol and everything. So they had this population of people who did peyote regularly. And then they had another population of people who were demographically similar who didn't do the peyote, and they tended to drink and do other things. And the population of peyote was healthier on every measure, physiologically and psychiatrically, than the people who didn't do peyote. They've done the same kind of research in South America with a church that uses ayahuasca as a sacrament. And these people tended to be more functional, have healthier family lives, and even be physiologically healthier than their counterparts who didn't do this. Yeah, there's a question over here. You want to wait for the microphone?
Can you hear me okay?
Well, I can repeat it. They need it for the recording is all.
So I had to write my question down because I wanted to make
Mm-hmm.
sure I say it correctly or ask correctly. So out of the individuals that were included in the trials, I'd like to know if there were any who did not suffer from the PTSD, any other individuals included, and if so, what were the results for those individuals?
Well, in the PTSD trials, it was required that you were diagnosed as severe PTSD and that it had been treatment resistant, that you had tried other things first. However, they have done other studies, as I said, of healthy people, just to see what the effects were on them. And in this, that was the study of healthy people at Johns Hopkins was the one that showed that they had what they felt were very significant emotional and personal experiences that they rated high on the scale of important events in their lifetime, and that those around them reported that their behaviors had changed in positive ways. And then, of course, in the smoking study, they didn't have PTSD, they were just smokers.
Are you thinking, or are they thinking that this type of research will generalize to other people who maybe have some type of mental health issues, but not necessarily?
I think they're thinking that there are quite a few mental health issues that this could be beneficial with. For instance, they're just now starting a study on adults with autism to see if this kind of therapy will help them learn to relate to people in a more successful way. Because there are anecdotal evidence of this use in the past. Remember, this was used clinically for 15 to 20 years before it was shut down. And so there's a lot of things that it had been used successfully for in those years that the people who were involved with that remember and think. One thing that it doesn't seem to, anything like really serious high-level mental illness, I don't think anybody's thinking that it's going to be very useful for that. This is more for things that are below psychotic or, schizophrenic. Yes.
You've been speaking of LSD. Would you discuss, I see you're also discussing ecstasy. Would you discuss testing or anything that's occurred with ecstasy?
Oh, no, ecstasy is what has been used in this study with the PTSD. Yes, most of the ecstasy is MDMA. That's the same thing. And that's not as strong. It doesn't have the, it's not as strong. It doesn't have as likelihood of having this full-blown mystical type experience. But what it does is it reduces a fear response. And the thing about PTSD that makes it seem right for that is that the thing with PTSD is that you have this trauma and then this whole fear around that trauma. And the fear is kind of like you're protecting this area of injury in your psyche. And so anything getting close to that provokes all the symptoms of PTSD that we see: rage, avoidance, sort of hallucinations. That's all this fear reaction saying, oh, you're getting too close to the injury. But the horrible irony is that the way to cure PTSD is to revisit the trauma and reprocess it in a healthy way. There's actually areas of the brain that do this, and the way that the traumatic memory was formed bypass the way normal memories are formed. And normally what happens is you get the input from the experience, and that experience is then set up for higher processing, and that's where all the perspective and you fit it into your life that way. But in a traumatic situation, survival takes over, and the brain doesn't have time to send it up for that processing, so it kind of sticks it down in the brain's basement, and then it's just like this moldering toxic thing down there, and there's all these don't touch signs around it. And one of the things, and MDMA actually on brain scan, it shows that it quiets the part of the brain that's responsible for the fear response. So people can let down their guard, and it also heightens the sort of type of part of the brain that's responsible for assessing things, and that's where the insights come from. So it's doing exactly what it needs to be done in order to untie this horrible knot. So that's mostly that. I mean, there is some talk about, and in the past, other psychedelic drugs have been used also for traumatic memories. But so far, MDMA is being really seen to be really helpful for that. Okay, for here.
Our final question.
I feel special now. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your role in this as a journalist. For example, how did you decide that a book would be the best way to cover this issue versus a series of news stories, or your role in the process?
Yeah, well, I started by writing a magazine story about it, and I've just felt that to really understand it, well, for a couple of things. The whole history of this is fascinating, and there's a lot, I'm just sketching over it in a really cursory way. But I felt that to understand, why we have such a trauma about these drugs, and that the history of the promise that has been almost totally forgotten by most people. Most people are not aware of this era where they were being used to great effect, and what they're aware of is the fear around these drugs. And also the incredibly dramatic story of these individuals who are bucking all of society's trends and everything. And their narrative of their story was so dramatic to me that I just needed more space to tell that story. And that's why I chose to do that. And as a writer, what I really wanted to do was I wanted to make this read more like a nonfiction novel than just something that's just sort of delivering information. Because I thought that the stories of these people, including the story of Nick, so there's a whole sections of the book that are just about Nick's experience in Iraq. Because I wanted people to understand how PTSD happened and how horrible it really was. So his experiences in Iraq really moved me, and I wanted to have people feel that. And then his horrible experience with having PTSD when he was back home was, really, just to understand how important it is that we actually bring something that can heal these things. So that really required a book. And in fact, I signed my book contract. It was for a 90,000 word book. I ended up writing 125,000 words. And I gave it to my editor and said, sorry, what do you suggest cut? And she ended up saying, no, let's just do this way. So I think we're out of time. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks to the USF Sarasota.
Thank you, Tom. What a lovely way to start our Knowledge-A-Bull this year, and a great intellectual conversation about the topic that you shared with us this evening. Please join us at our other Knowledge-A-Bull series throughout the year and some other things that will help us celebrate our 40th anniversary. There's some parties, so come out to the parties as well. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. There are books still for signing outside.